Tonight, Poland says multiple Russian drones were shot down. A home had a drone crash right through its roof. So after this Russian move tonight, President Trump posting online, quote, "Here we go."
It's Ken Harbaugh with the Midas Touch Network. That was our president's response to a fellow NATO member being attacked by Russia. Here we go. I know we got a lot of mileage here out of laughing at Donald Trump. He is a fool and he invites our mockery every day. But when the entire world is laughing at him, when American deterrence becomes a joke, the world is less safe. Vladimir Putin knows that he can do whatever he wants, including violating the territorial integrity of a close ally. And the most Donald Trump will do is post on social media. How many of Trump's deadlines have come and gone for Russia to stop bombarding civilian targets? And how many times has Trump folded like a cheap suit? You know the answer. Every time Trump tacos. You all know how I feel about the war in Ukraine, about how if we don't stop Russia now, Putin's aggression will spread. We're seeing that happen in real time. This incursion into Poland by Russian drones was not an accident. It was a provocation, a test not just of Poland's air defenses, but of our resolve. And we are failing that test because we elected a weak, feckless president whose response to an attack on a close ally is "here we go." I spoke with LtCol Alexander Vindman about this. You probably remember him for his incredibly courageous testimony about Donald Trump's so-called perfect call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. But Alex is also an expert on Russian and European security, and I wanted to get his take on all this. Here's our conversation. Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I've got retired Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman back. His testimony before Congress led to Donald Trump's second impeachment, and he has stayed on the forefront of the fight for democracy, both here at home and abroad ever since. The fight for democracy abroad, Alex, is now centered on Ukraine, which you used to call home, and is spreading. We just saw this incursion into Polish airspace, not the first time, but this felt different. This felt like a real test. Can you give us your take?
Yeah, so it's something that's been worrying me since the days before the war started. I wrote an article way back in January of 2022, about a month before, 6 weeks before the war started. And I said something this consequential, this large, describing it as a geopolitical earthquake, had a lot of different possibilities of spillover. And frankly, we've actually seen a lot of that spillover occur over the course of 3.5 years. It's been in the political domain. It's been in the economic domain. It's been in the informational domain. And in the military domain, I kind of refer to these, what we call DIME, the national elements of military power. Was also spilled over in that domain, but in a hybrid fashion, with regards to Russian sabotage operations and kind of, cyber attacks, including information operations. And it's brought in other powers. It's brought in the North Koreans and the Chinese. So this was always something that was going to be on the horizon. The question is the parameters, how broadly they would shift. And now we're seeing, probably one of the more dangerous shifts into just outright Russian aggression. So the estimation is about 20 unmanned aerial vehicles crossed over into Ukraine or into Poland. Some of them crash landed there, which means that they may have been destined for Poland. Historically, the Russians have transited through NATO member states, whether it's Poland, Romania, were the two kind of biggest victims of Russian violations of sovereignty. This one was different. This one was not just onesies and twosies, but a large package of drones and an intentional violation of Poland's sovereignty. And to me, it was clearly a test. It was a test of how Poland is going to respond, how NATO was going to respond, whether the air policing mission that we've had there since the war started, a NATO mission, was going to shoot down these aircraft. And more importantly, what would be the resolve out of NATO on the back end to defend a member state. Certainly, the most important aspect of NATO membership is this collective defense architecture. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's called Article 5. Below, I wouldn't say necessarily below that, but one of the other articles that's important is Article 4, which is consultations, escalation or a significant change in threat to the NATO environment. This is one of them. So Poland invoked Article 4 for consultations. My big issue is that the U.S. is part of NATO, and the U.S. under the Trump administration has no stomach for challenging Russian aggression, increasing the deterrence through shows of strength, shows of resolve. And since NATO is a consensus organization, there is little possibility that NATO in unison is going to respond. So this leaves Poland out there hanging. This leaves the eastern flank and a coalition that needs to respond in some significant way to deter further Russian adventurism. And that's where things get dangerous. There's a divide between already within NATO that certainly the Russians perceived and are testing to kind of prove their contentions, their hypothesis, and they're going to do that. And turns out that NATO will be divided, and this will encourage Russia to escalate. So I'm sure you're going to have some follow-up questions, but there was programs of response that I called for that would push back on this. But that's kind of the general picture right now. Quite a dangerous development. I think it's maybe one of the most significant developments in this war, any time in recent history.
Well, absolutely, because unlike the previous incursions, this almost certainly was intentional. The Russians have denied it. At one point, they actually blamed Poland. I don't know how they get away with that. But your description of spillover might suggest to some people that these kinds of conflicts spread accidentally, like World War I and just this entanglement of alliances. But this is in no way an accident. Putin has designs far beyond Ukraine, and this is a probe, if you will. It's what we used to do, testing the defenses of other countries. Hey, it's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break to say thank you to everyone who's been following and supporting this show and this channel. None of it happens without you. And if you haven't yet subscribed to my Substack page, I'd really appreciate the follow. It's a great way to make sure you never miss an episode. It's free to sign up. And if you're able to pitch in a few bucks, every dollar goes back into the show. Just search for The Ken Harbaugh Show on Substack or click the link below. Thanks. As you pointed out, it was a test not just of their aerial defense, but of NATO's resolve. And NATO, in this case, appears to be failing because of the United States.
So I think, I described it as spillover in this piece earlier in the war, and kind of really looking forward at how things could really draw in to a larger confrontation. But no, this was not accidental. This was a calculated test of NATO. I think in certain regards, accident and miscalculation results in spillover, but it could also be very, very intentional, the way the Russians are conducting this test of NATO right now. And they're doing it to try to warn off NATO involvement. They're trying to warn off Poland, which is essential to the support of Ukraine. Poland is the hub for almost all of the military material support passing through. So they want to message that, there's a risk of direct confrontation between Russia and Poland, thinking that, they could intimidate like they have historically. Except, unfortunately, I don't think Poland is quite as intimidated. There is really a powerful coalition of the willing that through kind of, what we call a correlation of forces, how the different militaries match up, Poland and its coalition, the willing, look very, very powerful. Maybe they're not fully prepared for this war because Russia's developed some interesting asymmetric capabilities, specifically, massive drone warfare capability that it'll be hard for Poland to respond to with its current tools. But regardless, this would not be this should be considered more of a test and a provocation and a political effort to drive wedges rather than Russia really pushing for a military confrontation, because they're certainly not ready for it. Now, it seems to me that because the U.S. is not going to be driving NATO deterrence, Poland still has a lot of tools in its arsenal. One of the most important things it needs to do is really needs to defend its sovereignty. It needs to make sure that Russia doesn't just not repeat this pattern, but doesn't escalate further based on opportunities or lack of will. So I think whether they get there or not, it might be just an inevitability. I think that Poland is going to have have a stated policy of destroying any Russian assets that it detects approaching or certainly at the edge of its borders. I don't think that's going to be enough. I think the next increment that's more reasonable is extending air policing and maybe a no-fly zone into Western Ukraine, specifically on the threat that these aircraft are directed. They have a vector headed towards Poland. Poland detects them and can knock them out of the sky. And in certain regards, that does actually help Ukraine's warfare. It provides a safe haven for Ukraine, but that is a consequences of Russia's own provocation. And you could see this even rationally being extended into the Baltic Sea, which shares Poland has a border with the Baltic Sea, and you could see it extending to the Black Sea and NATO Black Sea states, and really, in certain regards, actually aiding the Ukrainian war effort, but again, as a consequence of Russia's infringement on NATO member state sovereignty.
And totally justifiable in terms of international law based on Russia's behavior and incursions into Polish airspace. I'm so glad you highlighted the strength of Poland's military, especially when combined with that alliance of the willing. And when you look at their GDP expenditure going forward, they might actually be able to match the Russian military in certain theaters, given how degraded the Russian military now is. I don't know if you saw this, but I read somewhere that when Putin came to visit Alaska and have the red carpet rolled out for him, Russian fighters could not escort the presidential plane the whole way because they no longer have the capability to do that. The Russian military is a shell of what it once was, and it wasn't all that great to begin with. That was part one of my conversation with Alex Vindman. In part two, out Monday, we talk about nuclear deterrence and the reality that, as robust as Poland's self-defense might be, Russia still has a hammer that Poland cannot counter without the support of a nuclear power like the U.S. See you then.